Healthcare provision is about choices, and I'm sure we all know, and it's underpinned by opportunity cost. And the reason, health economics and cost effectiveness sounds unpleasant to many people, that costs are involved, but the key thing is that what you spend on something, on something, you're not spending on something else. There is an opportunity cost, and there are lost benefits. If you've invested money in one part of the health service, that means there's less money to invest in something else, and the opportunity cost is those benefits lost by not investing in something else. So that's why health economics is important. Economic evaluation, which is what I'll be reporting on in a minute, is a comparative analysis of alternative courses of action in terms of their costs and consequences. Something like a clinical trial lends itself very well to an economic evaluation because there's a comparison there in terms of consequences going on, and then a health economist can come along and work out the costs and consequences in both arms of the trial and do the comparison. So it's important to remember that health economic evaluation requires a comparison. So we're not interested in absolute costs and absolute outcomes. We tend to be interested in new treatments, not what they absolute cost, but how much more do they cost than what's been done already, and what's the extra benefit than what's been done already. Current practice is often a main comparator. Sometimes current practices do nothing. But that's why we're interested in incremental analysis. What's the difference in costs and the difference in consequences of option A, which may be a new rapid test for GBS, for example, compared to option B, which may be current practice. And current practice may be risk factor-based screening or culture. Important to note that cost effectiveness does not necessarily mean cost saving. It's sort of accepted that NICE and decision makers like the National Institute of Clinical and Health Excellence are prepared to spend extra money to get extra benefit up to a point, and there is a threshold. So when people use terms such as cost effectiveness, it doesn't necessarily mean cost saving, and in fact in many instances it doesn't, but it's cost effective given acceptable thresholds. So when we report results of economic evaluations, I'm sort of saying all this by way of background so you understand when I report my results later. So when we report the results of economic evaluations, they tend to be reported in terms of relative cost effectiveness. We might do something like additional cost per additional unit of benefit. That's the additional cost of the intervention compared to the comparison. It might be in natural units, such as additional cost per major outcome averted or additional cost per life saved. Or it might be additional cost per QALY. And cost per QALY is the generic currency that decision makers like NICE favour because it's not then related to a speciality. Cost per case of GBS avoided is very hard to interpret, but additional cost per QALY can be compared to a generic threshold. So that's why NICE like to have their results in terms of cost per QALY. And they have an acceptable threshold, and it's broadly £20,000 per QALY. So that means they are prepared to spend an additional £20,000 for an additional QALY. In this situation, just as sort of an aside in Group B Strep, when we're dealing with infants and newborn babies, it's very hard to assess quality of life. I'll come back to that. We usually use instruments and questionnaires, but it's not straightforward in this situation. So I know we all know this, I'm just saying it, but screening programs are large-scale initiatives in which people receive unsolicited offers of a test aimed at detecting disease at an earlier stage in its evolution than would otherwise occur. And so, by their nature, screening programs can be offered to lots of people, many of whom won't have the disease. Some will, and that's the point. I just want to mention the role of modelling here and the economic models. I am going to mention an economic model in a minute, and it's not in order to just make me look clever or sound like a black box or anything. There are reasons that we use models because trials aren't always possible, but we can use the data that exist if we do modelling studies. And so the role of a model in economic evaluation allows us to extrapolate the costs and effectiveness beyond the point of screening, in this case GBS, to an end point of interest. So you might screen a mother for Group B Strep She may be positive or negative, but what we really want to do is know whether whatever we do following that result will prevent the baby from getting it. So the outcome of interest is beyond the point of screening. Models allow you to reflect all appropriate evidence, and you can compare all relevant options and look at alternative testing strategies and compare those with current practice. So they allow you to use data from a number of different sources. You don't always have to wait for a trial. Obviously, trials are the gold standard. And so models can link intermediate clinical endpoints to final outcomes. So I just want to give a little summary about this paper. So this study was carried out in Birmingham, led from Birmingham, but there were other collaborators. I'd like to acknowledge those. Because it was published in the British Journal of Obs and Gynae about 5 years ago. The study was carried out about 2 years before that, with the lead times of publications. And because it can be quite difficult to interpret, economic valuations and cost effectiveness analysis are quite specialist, I'm going to go through this study, even though it's a bit old, and even though we were exploring the cost effectiveness of some rapid tests, which turned out not to be very effective. We also, because we used a model, we did manage to compare other options as well, and those may be relevant for this afternoon. So the risk of transmitting GBS to newborn is reduced when intrapartum antibiotics is administered sufficiently early before the baby's born. I know we all know that, and the UK policy is based on one or more risk factors. Now, our study was carried out 7, 8 years ago, published 5 years ago, and so we were adhering at the time to the 2003 guidelines, and so the guidelines have been gone through a lot. So we were adhering to these guidelines, the risk factors for indicating antibiotics for Group B strep in labour. We discussed alternative to risk factors, and at the time, we were discussing that some European countries and other Western countries like the USA were undertaking culture-based screening at 35 and 37 weeks, and using vaginal and rectal swabs. And at the time, and I've been very interested to hear the discussion that we've had on this today, there was a lot of concern from the research team that although they did that when it actually got to delivery, that was invalidated by the onset of labour. But we have heard results of 70 and 90% today, so that's very encouraging if that's the case. But our study was looking at rapid tests and to see if we could explore whether a rapid test could be carried out and give a result and target antibiotics before a woman delivered. So it's a study, it's a cohort study, and it's not a trial. So I'll tell you. Almost 5,000 women were approached at booking at 20 to 24 weeks, and they were asked again when they were presented in labour. We took vaginal and rectal swabs from women, and the enriched microbiological culture was taken at labour, and that was the proxy in our model for 35 to 37 weeks culture screening. So we didn't do it at 35, 37 weeks, we did it in labour, but we used that result as a proxy for that strategy, if you're with me. We tested against PCR and OIA. I'm not going to discuss those particularly because they didn't prove very useful in this study. We recorded the time and the resource use associated with all the testing that was carried out prospectively. And the rapid test result, if known before delivery, didn't change treatment. So that's important. We did the rapid test, we got the result, but it didn't change what was going to happen to the mother because it was a study. So the mother was treated, and the decision to give her intrapartum antibiotics was based on the risk factors as per guidelines. But because we were modelling this information, we could then include, having done the rapid test and predict what might have happened had we had the rapid test result in time, and so it was sort of a hypothetical analysis, and it became a hypothetical analysis. So with it being a model, we could test a number of strategies. So we tested no screening and no intrapartum antibiotics, the microbiological culture of vaginal and rectal swabs at 35 to 37 weeks. Although it wasn't that, it was a labour, but it was a proxy for this strategy. We did the rapid test of PCR during labour, the OIA during labour. We screened using one or more risk factors, screening using one or more risk factors and a rapid test, and then no risk factors and a rapid test given, and then routine untargeted antibiotics to all. So that was an option in the model. I'm not suggesting it's one that we favour, but it was an option in the model, and sometimes what models allow you to do is put slightly bizarre options or strategies, but the results of those more bizarre options and strategies can tell you if your model is working sensibly and giving sensible results. So we felt, because it was not going to do any harm, to put in all the strategies we could think of. A strategy that was mentioned this morning was culture and risk factor, and actually I noticed, looking back, we didn't do that one. I can't remember why, but we didn't deem it appropriate at the time, or didn't think about it. The main point of the study at the time was to explore the rapid test, and we just tried to put in as many other options as we could. So this is what a model looks like, or this is a small branch of a model. This is just a subsection of the model looking at the rapid test. Whether the rapid test led to a certain strategy was dependent on the probability of the mother being colonized, whether it was from a rectal, vaginal, or a combination of both that the positive result came. We looked at the difference between spontaneous delivery and caesarean. Obviously, it was key that we got the rapid test result in time before the baby was born, and dependent on the result. So all this data came from the study. But where we started going to when the baby was colonized, and whether we were avoiding risks of early onset GBS from our strategy, was obviously from secondary sources. I wouldn't normally show a slide of costs because people like to know them, but it's always all relative, but anyway, I am. So we did primary costing on the PCR and OIA. So we actually, did a time and motion study to see how much they cost, and so those are there. The culture test, we also did that in primary costing, bottom-up costing, and so where the PCR test cost roughly £30, the test using culture was about £10. We've got the cost of antibiotics, and the cost that I've drawn my attention to during today has been the cost for early onset GBS death and early onset GBS no death. So this is 7 years ago, and I can't remember the details behind these costs now, except we'd taken them from another study, which was this study, which was published at the same time. And this study by Colburn et al. Was a systematic review. So they'd surveyed all the data, available data at the time, and come up with this cost. I must admit that looking at it now and hearing the discussion, it sounds a bit low. And so I will be going back and scrutinising how they got. Sorry, 2 minutes, okay. Be scrutinising how they got that cost. Cost in economic evaluation, because they extend into the future, there's a health economist discount cost. So that's another reason why it's probably looking low, and clearly it doesn't include the litigation costs that we've heard about. Right. So I've told you where we've got our data sources from. The primary outcome was early onset group B strep associated infant death, and the secondary outcome was disease avoided. I'm just showing this for completeness, but the tests that we were looking at were not very sensitive or specific, and that shows up in the results. 1,400 women were finally in the study. 308 had risk factors. For the PCR test, we determined that it would get the result in time if labour didn't happen before 80 minutes, and obviously the OIA test was quicker, and you'd get the result in time if labour didn't happen before 37 minutes after taking the test. But these are irrelevant results. These results are results, and this was discussed by another study. So what happens in cost effectiveness analysis is that you have all your relevant options, and other options are dominated if they are less effective and more costly. So the options that are they drop out, and the options that we left with from our sort of big screening model were risk factors, the culture test at 35 weeks, and routine antibiotics to all. Now, I just want to emphasize about these costs. This one is for the cost per case of infant disease avoided. That's a cost, it's not a saving. Someone referred to this earlier as a cost saving. It's not a saving. It would cost that to avoid that case. And in particular, this is cost per case of death avoided. Now, obviously, we want, if we can, results in QALYs. Now, we don't have that for this group. So what we do with these results is divide by the life expectancy, and then so that brings it to a cost per QALY. I won't bore you with the other things that life expectancy is discounted and other things. So the main result that we found that doing nothing, no screening and no antibiotics was least costly, obviously, but it was also less effective. And for every 1 million infants born, 36 would die as a result of the disease. Routine untargeted antibiotics compared to do nothing was the most favourable strategy. So that's where the model, helps us. That was a sensible result in terms of what we put in. We put in the cost of antibiotics, which was very low. Antibiotics, obviously, are very effective at the moment. What we didn't put in was the cost of resistance, which is a massive penalty that we should apply, and so that wasn't in. And we didn't put in costs associated with anaphylaxis. So, this is an option that we quickly ruled out, but it showed us that the model was sort of behaving sensibly for what we put in. We also know that giving antibiotics to everybody without even bothering testing would not be acceptable. But it showed us that, when you've got rubbish tests, it's such a bad outcome to give just antibiotics to everybody. If it's cheap and effective, is an obvious thing to do, but not if there are side effects and resistance issues. So the cost per QALY was within the nice threshold, but we ruled that option out. The next option that we had was culture at 35 to 37 weeks. That was the next most favourable. It wasn't quite within the NICE guideline at 23,000 per QALY, but it was close. But this comes with a warning. The warning is that it was a proxy. We didn't do it at the time. We didn't do it at 35 to 37 weeks. We did it later. We've also, sorry, I've just got to check my results for this warning. It was also very, very sensitive, as I'll show you later, to the cost that we found for the culture test. And the results for this cost per QALY are based on assuming that everyone that survived was in full health, which was all we could do. It was a severe assumption, but it was all we could do. We found that when we changed the cost of culture to just by £1, it was quickly not cost effective, and risk factor screening became the most effective option. There are other sensitivity analysis results here, but I won't go through them because of time, but basically to say that the results we got showed culture was a contender, but it's a close run thing. The cost of culture will be really critical in that, and the probability of culture from 35 weeks lasting till labour is obviously key as well. And so if we remove culture, risk factor screening was the best next option. So the issues are that, you don't have to test anyone, just give everyone antibiotics, but there are big, big concerns with that, clearly, whether it's acceptable to women, the medicalisation of labour, but most of all, the big issue that is a time bomb waiting, which is the resistance issues. Culture at 35 to 37 weeks looks like a possible contender, and you've seen the answers based on the evidence that we had. Both the results are based on the assumption that survivors were in full health, which we know they probably won't be, but we didn't have any better data. And that given all the evidence, risk factor screening seemed an option. The limitations are that in this situation, we really needed to know what current practice was, because our model is calibrated. You know, in a model, you put the prevalence of the disease and the incidence of the disease, and you assume that's based on practice, which might be do nothing or screen people. And if it's heterogeneous, you don't know what the prevalence relates to. Does it relate to people screening or not? And so that's a really key thing to understand cost effectiveness. And whether it's consistent or not. Because the comparator, health economics is all about comparisons, the comparator will impact on the results. And resistance issues of antibiotics, that's a big challenge for the future. And we've used the assumption that infants are in full health, and that's a worry. We have a future study that's funded but not quite through all the process yet. Colleagues can tell you about that. And finally, just to clarify that the challenges that we remain for cost effectiveness of this disease are that we need to understand what current practice is, because it affects the comparator that we put in our models. Cost per quality is probably really impossible without some severe assumptions. We need to establish better estimates for costs associated with the disease. Rapid tests need to be cheap, sensitive, and produce results before delivery. And we need to explore alternatives to intrapartum antibiotics. And we need to use a model. We're not really trying to be difficult. Thank you.